Welcome everyone. Today I'll be going over stat recommendations for PvP builds. As a heads up, most of what I know about stats is for DPS classes, though probably healers don't have many, if any, stat differences. Before I get into the stat recommendations themselves, I thought I'd go ahead and mention the difference between ratings and total stat percentages. Any stats you get in the form of straight numbers, such as 300, 900, 1000, etc., are added to the ratings side of your character sheet. Like that's on the left, you can see it on the screen here. The rating side is also added to the total side of your as well. If your item level matches your rating in a stat, then it means you are capped for the rating side of that stat. So if your item level was 46k as an example, and you have 46k accuracy as an example, then your accuracy is capped for the rating side, and adding more will not increase your total accuracy any further. Any stats you receive in the form of a percentage increase aren't part of the rating side of your sheet. So if you had something grant you a 1%, 5%, 10%, etc. to a stat, these are added directly to the total stat side of on the right. The stat total side of your sheet caps at 90% for most things. So if you got your rating capped out and you've got enough other sources that are added directly to the total, then you can hit 90% in certain stats. Now, in PvP, you cannot hit 90% for all stats, but you can hit 90% for some of them, such as power and critical severity. Now, when you have a stacking stat gear bonus, such as Ribcage, Whisper's Hood, Watcher's Weapons, Sky's Peaking Light Ring, etc., which I can show you here. Ribcage, Bone Devils, Ribcage here, Whisper's Hood, Watcher Weapons, and I don't have Sky's Peaking Light, but that also stacks up a stat increase in combat. These essentially increase your stats while you're in combat, these bonuses. Plus a few other prerequisites, like if you look at the Ribcage, you need to hit for at least 10% of your maximum hit points in a single blow in order to proc it. But essentially all this, like there's a bunch of things that essentially boil down to your stats are going to be higher when you're actually fighting than when you're standing still. Keep this in mind when figuring out if you have hit the recommendations for each stat in PvP or not. Notably, some class features and feats also increase your stats. Rogue, for example, has a feat that increases your critical chance by a random amount on each attack. Only some of these sources actually show up on your character sheet, so the stats won't necessarily appear here for all items on class sections. And Hastily Sharpened Blades, last time I tested it, was one of those weird items where it definitely works because you can find the results on third-party programs like ACT, but it does not show it visually on your character sheet. So when your critical strike is increased by this feat, the only way to detect it is with ACT. You won't find it just by looking at your sheet. Now, some things are not like this. Like if you look at this Skillful Infiltrator down here, this actually is visible. For some reason, this actually does show up on your sheet, but Hastily Sharpened Blades does not. Now, to go over each of the stats one by one that I recommend. As you can see, I put some text on the screen there. That is the power recommendation for PvP builds. You want 90% in combat, and this is the top priority offense stat in PvP for pretty much everything. Now, as you can see, I changed the stat on the screen again. Critical severity, same recommendation as power. You want 90% in combat. This is the second highest priority offense stat in PvP for pretty much everything. Moving on to a more complicated stat that gets a lot of people confused. Accuracy, like, give me a sec. Okay, so accuracy recommendations for PvP. Your first goal, you want to have 50% standing still. Now, your recommendation for classes that don't have accuracy 40 is 63%, and this is because that's what it is standing still for a class that does not have help from accuracy 40. Like Rogue, this is what you would be able to hit standing still. You wouldn't be able to get anything higher than that. Now, the recommendation for classes that do have accuracy 40 is 70% through 90%. Now, only Fighter and Ranger actually have accuracy 40, so they're the only ones that would have 70% through 90% like that. Everything else is going to be at around that 63% maximum standing still. Now, you want the accuracy stat as high as you can get on most builds. The exception are builds that don't need high damage, such as the Bard class and healers. Now, Ranger and Fighter, as I mentioned before, they have accuracy 40, so they can reach 70% through 90% accuracy really easily. Other classes usually cannot pass 70%, as I mentioned, accuracy in combat. Like, other classes usually have that 63% I mentioned, and they cannot pass 70% even in combat usually. Now, accuracy actually gains effectiveness the more of it you have. So if your accuracy is higher than your opponent's deflection severity is, like you have accuracy here and you've got deflect severity down here. So if your accuracy is higher than your opponent's deflection severity is, then you will deal extra damage to that enemy whenever they deflect. Now, they will actually take more damage when they deflect in most cases when you've got high accuracy like this than when they don't deflect. So, again, that gets into why deflect is a bad stat. And why accuracy is a really, really good stat. Because that stat gains a lot of effectiveness the more of it you have. Like, you really start to notice it at 50%. And it just keeps getting better and better the more of it you have. Okay, moving on. As you can see, I changed the text on the screen again. And this is the critical chance recommendation for PvP. Now, your first goal, like accuracy, would be 50% standing still. Now, your recommendation, the recommendation would be 60% standing still, and 70% or higher in combat is what I really recommend. Now, 70% or higher is really easy to hit on a rogue, but it's kind of hard to do on some of the other classes. Now, rogue does not actually have critical strike 40 or anything, but we have that hastily sharpened blade's feat, so generally it's very easy for rogue to have high critical. Now, fighter also apparently has some bonuses to critical chance, if I remember right, so they tend to have an easy time capping that as, well, not capping it, but they have an easy time getting that high. Now, critical strike is a higher priority than accuracy is for Bard. For the other DPS classes, accuracy is a higher priority than critical strike is, but you still want good numbers for both. Moving the text again. Okay, next up we have defense. Now, the first goal for defense is 45% standing still. Now, your second goal is 50% standing still. My recommendation is to go all the way and get the full 56% standing still. Defense is a very high priority to stack. If your defense is too low, your build will be too fragile in PvP. defense needs to be stacked in combination with self-healing sources and HP in order for you to survive well in PvP. That's basically the big three. Like for defensive, for well-rounded defenses in PvP, you want capped defense, you want high HP, and you want a decent amount of self-healing. Like if you've got good amounts of all of those, you have a well-rounded set of defenses for PvP. Okay, now moving on. Okay, moving on, we have movement speed. Now, movement speed is valuable to stack a little bit of on most classes. The exception is Bard. They get most of their movement from encounter powers. Now, normal movement speed numbers right now are anywhere between 60% through 90%. Now, make sure to slot Azure enchantments. Like, I think I've got some of those here. It does not want to let me show you the tooltip. Okay, there it is. You can see it there. Make sure to slot Azure enchantments in your utility slots and also put 5 points in the Marathon Runner campaign boon, and you can optionally add more. Like I'll show you Marathon Runner real quick. That's about 12.5% movement in like when you've got all 5 points. Moving on. Now there are some other good stats around, but you don't really try that hard to stack them usually. For example, combat advantage damage, this right here. Okay, so with combat advantage, none of the other classes need to stack the combat advantage stat. Rogue does need to make sure that they always have combat advantage active whenever they attack, but they don't actually need to stack the stat at all. It's not like in Mod 19 where rogues were stacking ridiculous amounts of combat advantage back then. In Mod 20 and 21 both, rogues no longer stack any combat advantage on purpose, but they do still need to have combat advantage active whenever they attack, otherwise they just don't do enough damage. Ranger is a weird fact about combat advantage for them. They can actually deal a little bit less damage when their combat advantage is active than they do on a regular hit. Now, the AP gain stat and the recharge speed stats aren't that important anymore, but mostly because of the very tiny amount of these that are available now. But they are nice to have. Like, they do help a little bit. Some classes like Bard might want to consider stacking a little bit of recharge speed via things like Dragonheart artifacts if they're not maxed out. But again, that's optional. Now, stamina gain is nice, like you can see that here. But in some classes do use the stamina gain jewel kits instead of the combat advantage jewel kits. But it's not that important to stack stamina gain, but some builds do actively try to do so. Deflection severity is a good stat, like I'll show you that here. Like, deflection severity is a good stat, but you probably can't afford to stack any. You need other things more. Don't confuse deflection severity with deflect. Deflect is bad, deflect severity is good. Awareness is situational. Like this stat. Like, this is a situational stat. It's very similar in terms of how it works to defense. But it's situational because it requires combat advantage to be active in order for this to really do anything. Like, your enemy has to have combat advantage against you before there's a point to this. But when your enemy does have that combat advantage against you, it can be really good in combination with other things. It helps you significantly when you get ganked or proned. Like when I got surrounded a long time ago when I was using this stat a little bit, this stat actually did have some value to it. I actually used to have a build several modules ago that had a little bit of awareness added to it on purpose. But right now, you wouldn't stack this stat on purpose usually. Mostly just because you wouldn't have room to stack it. You need your points allocated into other stuff more. Now, critical avoidance, going down to that, this is decent, but again, it's not a high priority to stack this. DPS cleric and healers might still have some use for it. Uh, 40, this right here, it's not showing me that. Wow, it really does not want to let me show you that tooltip. Okay, you can kind of see it there. But anyway, the 40 stat is good. It's a good stat as well, but it gives you a small increase to, and it gives you a small increase to 3 of your other stats. Which 3 stats these are varies by class, but you usually don't actively try to stack it. It's better to stack these stats directly. So, although this 40 does give you a bonus to 3 of your other stats, in most cases it'll be more efficient to just directly stack the stats that you wanted instead of trying to stack 40. That, and there's not that many places you could pull 40 from. Moving on. Okay, the final stat I'll bring up again in PvP is Deflect. Now, this stat is bad. It's the only truly bad PvP stat. Now, Deflect, or Deflection Chance, whatever you want to call it, is by far the worst stat in PvP. It causes you to take extra damage in PvP if your opponent's accuracy exceeds your deflection severity. So never stack Deflect, because again, deflecting hits can, in most cases, make you take more damage than getting hit normally. So you don't want to deflect because you will literally take extra damage from it. Now, I'm pretty sure that's everything, guys. Talk to you guys next time.